For 20 years I'd lived on the edge of the forest. The thick pines and sprawling oaks were more familiar to me than any city street or crowded cafe. As the town's forester, I kept watch over the woods, ensuring it remained healthy, free of disease, and unmarked by irresponsible logging. I had spent so many years under its dense canopy that it felt like the forest and I were one and the same, connected by something deeper than roots or trails. The town trusted me. They saw me as the guardian of the woods. And in return, I made it my life's work to know every inch of the land, from the old creek bed in the west to the moss-covered stones in the east. I thought I understood the forest's rhythms, its moods and its secrets. But I was wrong. It started with the accident. The day was bright, the kind of autumn afternoon where the light filters through the golden leaves and the air carries a crisp, clean bite. I was doing my usual rounds, checking for signs of deer overpopulation or signs of disease spreading in the bark. That's when I heard the shot. It echoed through the trees, sharp and too close for comfort. Hunting season had begun, and while I didn't love the idea of people trampling through my woods, it was part of the deal here, an agreement between the forest and the people. But something about that shot sent a chill through me. I moved quickly toward the sound, pushing through the underbrush, the wind suddenly feeling colder. The forest, which had been alive with birdsong and the occasional rustle of small animals, fell silent. When I reached the clearing, the first thing I saw was a figure lying on the ground, motionless. A boy, barely 18, with a crimson stain spreading across his chest. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly up at the sky, as if caught between this world and the next. The hunter stood nearby, his rifle hanging limply at his side, his face as white as the clouds drifting lazily overhead. "I didn't mean to," the hunter stammered, his voice shaking. He just stepped out from nowhere. I swear I didn't see him." The boy's name was Ethan. He was known around town, everyone knew everyone here, but I had never spoken to him directly. A quiet kid, someone who preferred to keep to himself. Seeing him like that, the life drained from him, left a deep pit in my stomach. The forest felt wrong in that moment, like it had betrayed us all. The authorities arrived soon after, taking the hunter away for questioning. It was a terrible accident, they said. He wouldn't be charged. Ethan wasn't wearing the proper bright gear to identify himself, and the hunter had been legally hunting. A tragedy, but nothing more. But for me it wasn't so simple. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself had played a part in it. The way it had fallen silent just before the shot, the way the air had turned cold as I ran to the scene. I'd been living in these woods long enough to know when something felt off, and this felt deeply wrong. Ethan was buried a few days later in the town cemetery, just outside the forest's edge. His parents were devastated, the small town grief-stricken. A few of the older folk said the woods had taken him, that sometimes the forest demanded a sacrifice. I dismissed it at the time, chalking it up to superstition, but deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. I couldn't shake the feeling that the accident was more than just a random tragedy. After the funeral, things in the forest began to change. It was subtle at first. The sounds of the forest grew quieter, as though the birds and animals were holding their breath. The wind didn't seem to move the trees the same way. I started finding strange things, small piles of rocks in odd formations, branches twisted together in shapes that I'd never seen before. Then there were the whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind. I'd be walking the trails and the wind would pick up, carrying with it soft sounds that were almost like voices, too faint to understand but just clear enough to unsettle me. Sometimes it sounded like someone calling out from deep within the woods, far beyond where anyone should have been. One evening, as the sun set and the forest began to slip into the darkness of night, I was out on my usual patrol. The air was heavy, thick with the coming cold. As I walked the trails, I felt it again, that strange sensation that the forest was watching me. I stopped listening. And that's when I heard it. "Ethan." It was barely more than a breath, a faint voice carried on the wind. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't possible. The forest was playing tricks on me. But the voice came again, clearer this time. "Ethan." It was coming from deeper in the woods, beyond the marked trails. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone passing through, someone lost. But there was no mistaking it now. Someone, or something, was calling Ethan's name. I followed the sound, moving off the trail and into the denser part of the forest where the trees pressed in tighter, their branches clawing at the sky. The deeper I went, the more I felt the temperature drop, as if I were walking into some unnatural cold. My breath came out in thick puffs of mist, and the air smelled damp, like the earth after a heavy rain. The trees seemed to loom taller, their shadows longer, and the whispers grew louder, though they still remained just beyond my understanding. Then I saw it. In the distance, through the trees, there was a figure, a pale, motionless silhouette standing among the shadows. My heart leapt into my throat. For a moment I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I moved closer I saw that it was no trick. It was Ethan. He stood there, silent, his face pale and his eyes hollow, staring straight at me. The blood stain on his shirt was still there, as vivid as the day of the accident. His lips moved but no sound came out. My legs locked in place and I stood frozen, unable to breathe. Ethan's mouth opened wider, and this time, I could hear the faintest of whispers escaping his lips. Why? The words sliced through the air like a knife, and in that moment, the forest seemed to pulse around me, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Ethan took a step forward, his feet moving soundlessly over the fallen leaves. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. The branches clawed at me as I pushed through the undergrowth, my lungs burning from the cold air. I didn't stop until I was back at the edge of the forest, gasping for breath. When I turned around there was nothing behind me. The woods were still silent. But I knew what I had seen. Something had changed in the forest. And Ethan was still out there. I blinked. Just once. And in that instant Ethan vanished. One moment he was there standing between the trees, pale, bloodied and accusing, and the next he was gone. The forest swallowed him whole as if he had never been there at all. My heart raced, hammering against my ribs as I stood there, rooted to the spot, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Had I imagined it? Could the shock of the accident, the weight of my guilt, have twisted my mind so much that I conjured Ethan's ghost from the shadows of the forest? But the silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, it was a complete and total void, a deafening absence of sound. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, no whispering wind. Just a thick, suffocating stillness that pressed down on me from all sides. I needed to get out of the woods. I needed to get to the safety of my cabin, the small forest house where I had lived for 2 decades, nestled just on the edge of town but deep enough in the woods that it felt like a sanctuary. Without another glance behind me, I turned and hurried through the trees, stumbling over roots and rocks in my desperate need to escape. The forest that had once felt like home now seemed alien, its towering trees looming over me like silent sentinels, watching my every move. By the time I reached my cabin, night had fully descended. The sky was a deep, inky black, and the thin sliver of the moon did little to illuminate the path. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the key, forcing it into the lock and wrenching the door open. I slammed it shut behind me, twisting the deadbolt into place with a shaky breath. Inside, the cabin was cold and dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the embers still smoldering in the fireplace. I grabbed the lantern from the table, lighting it quickly and holding it up to cast a flickering orange glow around the small room. My heart was still racing, my skin cold with fear. But it was just the cabin. My cabin. Nothing had changed. The worn furniture, the dusty shelves lined with old books and tools, the sturdy wooden walls, it was all just as it had been for years. And yet, something felt different. The air was thick, heavy with the same unnatural weight I had felt in the forest. The oppressive silence seemed to follow me inside, clinging to the very walls. Then I heard it. A faint thud, like something tapping against the window. I froze, the lantern shaking in my hand. The sound came again, louder this time, a rhythmic knocking as if something, or someone, was testing the window. My mouth went dry and I turned slowly toward the sound, my pulse thundering in my ears. The curtains swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. I took a hesitant step forward, inching toward the window, my breath shallow and quick. The knocking continued, steady, deliberate. And then, just as I reached the window, it stopped. Silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the closed curtains, waiting for something, anything, to happen. My mind raced with thoughts of Ethan, of his pale, ghostly figure standing in the woods. Was he here now? Had he followed me? But nothing happened. The knocking didn't return and the house remained eerily still. I let out a shaky breath, the tension in my body easing just slightly as I pulled the curtains aside. Nothing. Just the forest, dark and quiet, stretching out into the night. The trees stood still, their branches motionless in the still air. I tried to calm myself, convincing my racing mind that it had all been in my head, that the forest hadn't followed me here, that Ethan, whatever I thought I'd seen, was nothing more than a figment of my imagination. I shut the curtains, turned away from the window, and tried to settle in for the night. But the house didn't want to let me rest. The sound started again, this time from the door. A soft scraping like nails dragging across the wood, slow and methodical. I sat up straight in my chair, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, more persistent, as though something was trying to get in, something that knew exactly where I was and exactly how to find me. I stood, gripping the lantern tightly, and moved toward the door. My feet felt heavy, every step dragging as I approached. The scraping stopped, leaving behind a silence that was somehow worse than the noise itself. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grasped the handle and yanked the door open. Nothing. The empty night greeted me, cold and silent. The forest, dark and impenetrable, lay beyond the porch, and for a moment I thought I saw something move, just a flicker of motion, a shadow darting between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. I shut the door and locked it again, my nerves frayed and my mind racing. I couldn't stay here, not like this. I considered heading back to town, to the safety of other people, but the thought of leaving the cabin, of walking through the forest at night, filled me with a terror I couldn't shake. I was trapped, by my own fear, by the forest itself. The rest of the night passed in fits and starts. I dozed off in the chair, the fire slowly dying as the hours stretched on. But every time I closed my eyes I saw him, Ethan, standing in the clearing, his lifeless eyes fixed on mine, his mouth forming the same question. Why? When dawn finally broke, it came quietly, with none of the usual warmth or peace I was used to. The sky remained overcast, the sunlight weak and pale, barely filtering through the thick canopy of trees. I opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch, and breathed in the cool morning air. The forest looked normal again. Birds chirped in the distance, the wind rustled through the leaves, and the sounds of the woods returned, as if the previous night had been nothing more than a bad dream. I almost convinced myself that it had been a terrible, grief-stricken hallucination brought on by the accident and the guilt that weighed on me. But as night began to fall once more, the sense of dread returned. The air grew colder, heavier, and that suffocating silence began to creep back in. I tried to distract myself, busying my hands with tasks around the cabin. Chopping firewood, cleaning the dusty shelves, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to the events of the previous night. But as the sky darkened and the shadows lengthened, I could feel it again, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as though something was watching me. By the time the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, I knew I wasn't alone. I was sitting by the fire trying to read when I felt it, a presence, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me from all sides. I glanced up and my heart stopped. Outside, just beyond the window, stood the silhouette of a figure. It was tall, unmoving, standing at the edge of the tree line, half hidden by the shadows of the forest. But even in the darkness I could see it clearly enough to know that it was Ethan. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there watching, his hollow eyes fixed on the cabin. My body froze, paralyzed by the sight of him. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The fire crackled softly beside me, the only sound in the otherwise silent room. I watched him through the window, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for him to do something, anything. But he didn't. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at his motionless figure, waiting for him to disappear, waiting for the night to end. But he never moved, never blinked, never made a sound. He just watched. And I knew in that moment that the forest hadn't let him go. And neither had I. Night settled over the forest like a suffocating blanket, the darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the moonlight whole. Inside the cabin, the fire had long since died down to smoldering embers, leaving only a faint glow that flickered across the walls. I sat in the same chair I had spent the previous night in, my eyes fixed on the window, heart pounding in my chest. He was still there, Ethan, standing motionless at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the reach of the porch light. His figure was dark, his face hidden in shadow, but I knew it was him. The same pale boy I had found lifeless in the woods, the same boy whose name had haunted the trees ever since. I could feel him watching me, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me like a physical force. My throat was dry, my hands trembling as they gripped the armrests of the chair. I had spent the last hour staring back at him, waiting, hoping he would fade into the night like some fevered nightmare. But he didn't move. I wasn't sure how long I could take this. The tension was unbearable, like a rope slowly tightening around my neck, each second bringing me closer to breaking. Then, without warning, Ethan took a step forward. My breath caught in my throat. He moved slowly, deliberately, his body barely making a sound as he crossed the distance between the trees and the cabin. I watched, frozen in place, as he approached the porch. The light from the lanterns cast eerie shadows across his face, illuminating the blood-stained shirt, the wide, hollow eyes. He stopped at the base of the steps, his gaze fixed on me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, in a voice so soft it barely reached me, Ethan said, "It's not fair, is it?" The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, unsure if I should respond. My mind screamed at me to run, to bolt out the back door and disappear into the woods. But my body refused to move. What isn't fair? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan tilted his head slightly, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. Life, he said, his tone flat, emotionless. It just ends? Like that. He snapped his fingers, the sharp sound cutting through the stillness of the night. 1 minute you're alive and the next, you're not. I couldn't look away. His words, so calm, so matter-of-fact, twisted in my gut. There was something wrong about the way he spoke, like he was reciting lines from a script, detached from the reality of his own death. I didn't see him, I blurted out, my voice trembling. The hunter, he didn't see you. It was an accident, Ethan. You shouldn't have been out there. An accident? Ethan repeated, his lips curling into a cold, humorless smile. Is that what they call it? An accident when someone ends up in the ground before they even get to live? Before they turn 20? He stepped closer, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden porch. I could see him clearly now, his skin pale as moonlight, his clothes stained with the blood from the wound that had taken his life. His eyes, though, they were black, empty voids that seemed to pull me in, suffocating me with their coldness. I had plans, Ethan continued, his voice low, almost a growl. I had a life ahead of me. But none of that matters now, does it? Because someone thought I was a deer. He spat the last word, the venom in his tone undeniable. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? The truth of the accident weighed heavily on me, the guilt gnawing at my insides. I had known Ethan's family for years, had seen him grow up from a shy kid into a quiet but capable young man. And now he was gone. Gone because of a mistake. A tragic, irreversible mistake. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice cracking. I'm so sorry, Ethan. Sorry. Ethan's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Sorry doesn't bring me back, Nick. Sorry doesn't make up for the years I lost. For everything I'll never get to do. His voice rose, anger seeping into his words. I'll never get to finish school. I'll never leave this fucking town. I'll never fall in love, never have a family, never grow old. I'll never get to live. His fists clenched at his sides, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something else behind his hollow eyes. Something darker. Something that had nothing to do with the boy I had once known. And you know what's the worst part? He asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You get to keep going. You get to keep living your life. You get to walk these woods like nothing ever happened. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. That's not true. I've carried this with me every day since you died. Don't lie to me. Ethan snarled, his voice twisting into something inhuman, something far darker than I could have imagined. His figure seemed to warp, his pale skin taking on a sickly gray hue, his eyes blacker than the night itself. You've been living in this forest like nothing happened, like I didn't die under your watch. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nowhere to run. Ethan advanced, his body flickering like a candle in the wind, his form growing more grotesque with each step. His limbs elongated, his fingers stretching into claws that scraped against the wooden floor, leaving deep gouges in their wake. I had a life, he screamed, his voice a guttural roar. And you took it from me. I backed into the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps as Ethan loomed over me, his monstrous form casting a dark, twisted shadow across the room. His eyes bore into mine, filled with fury, grief, and something far more sinister. You know what's fair, Nick? He hissed, his face inches from mine. His breath was cold, like the air in a crypt. You joining me? That's fair. Before I could react, Ethan lunged. His hands, cold and clawed, wrapped around my throat, squeezing with impossible strength. I gasped, my vision blurring as the air was forced from my lungs. I clawed at his hands, my nails scraping uselessly against his skin. His eyes, those black, soulless pits, filled my vision as my body grew weaker and weaker. You'll lie in the ground next to me, he growled, his voice dripping with malice. Your grave will be right beside mine. And every day people will walk by and see it. Ethan. And Nick. I fought to breathe, fought to push him off, but it was no use. His grip tightened, and the world around me began to fade, the edges of my vision going dark. I could hear the sound of my heartbeat in my ears, slowing, fading. My body felt heavy, sinking as if the earth itself was pulling me down. Nick the Forester, Ethan whispered, his lips curling into a smile as the last of my strength drained away. Buried where he belongs. And then, with one final, crushing squeeze, the darkness took me. In the days that followed, the people of the town would search the forest. They would find Ethan's grave, freshly dug, with his name carved into the simple wooden marker. And next to it they would find another grave. A new one. Nick the Forester. No one would ever understand how it came to be. No one would ever know what really happened in those dark, cursed woods. And no one would ever see Nick again.